Tonight, the 11th chapter of Daniel, lesson number 22. We're on page 91 of your lesson guide, and there are some out there in the lobby if you need them. Page 91, lesson 22. We're down to Antiochus IV, the one who is the despicable or the despised person. And so when the scriptures call you that, and not just Yosemite Sam, you know you've done something. You have distinguished yourself in not a good way. And so we're in this blow-by-blow prophecy where Daniel tells us these things that are coming. We saw our key points again. We've been in this lesson before. But God knew and controlled what the saints would face for generations to come. That's one of the lessons we can draw from this, as Matt made mention in his prayer. The Jewish struggles and victories and interactions with world powers are described. And so in these chapter 11, we start with Persians. We go to Greeks. By the time we get done, we'll have Romans. So we'll have the big empires of the ancient world. We'll also see as we go into chapter 12, because this long chapter 11, the prophecy really spans, and the situations really spans chapters 10 through chapter 12. So as we get into chapter 12, we'll see the ultimate end is the victory for the Messiah of God. So Daniel 10, there was that terrifying man, very similar to the risen Christ in Revelation 1, who appeared to John, and there's a number of similarities between this and the Revelation in the New Testament. Then we also noted important thing in this prophecy is really concerned very much with who is in control of Judea and Jerusalem. And so it was the Persians when Daniel has this vision. They had just taken control. But then will come Alexander, and he will be described as that, the great king who comes and does whatever he wants and comes with great fury and anger. And then we'll have ruling Judea the Ptolemies, the rulers from Egypt. They'll have about 100 years. Then we'll have the Seleucids. They're the Greek family, again, of descendants of one of Alexander's generals, the Seleucid family in Damascus. They'll control Jerusalem for a while. Through this person, this despicable one, there will come a great rebellion and a time of great suffering. And I think it's pretty easily and just universally acknowledged that that is the vision of the Maccabean revolt. Our despicable and despised person, that'll be Antiochus IV. And Judas Maccabee will be our other person of note in this time. The descendants of the Maccabees, it's through one of the younger brothers of Judas, because his direct descendants are all killed in the revolt. A lot of the large family is lost. But one branch of the family, known as the Hasmoneans, will then for just about 100 years rule a Jewish empire. And that will be very important to the formation of New Testament times. And that will be a Jewish priestly family who rules as king in Jerusalem. And if that sounds a little bit like the Messiah, and some of the things that there is some similarities, but also a great deal of differences to which a number of religious people objected. And then we'll have the Roman rule of Judea at the end of this prophecy. That Roman rule, I mean, just kind of pick a date as far as when it actually, the Roman rule ends. Because when does the Roman Empire end? And anyway, it's the Romans or the early Byzantines. They'll eventually, they'll rule Jerusalem and Judea up until about 614. They'll eventually just kind of collapse and lose it. And also then in the 600s will come the followers of Muhammad out of the east, and they'll have control of Jerusalem for about the next 500 years. But you probably don't want to hear about the Crusades at this point. So this control of Jerusalem, and this is the section of it that is under the purview of this prophecy. All right, so then we saw what this foretold was Persian rule, Greek rule. Then there seems to be a gap in the prophecy. That seems to be pretty universally acknowledged. I think when the gap is over, down in verse 36, then we have the rule of Herod foretold even, the great king of the New Testament, Herod the Great. I mean great in the sense of powerful. I don't mean great in the sense of good, obviously. And then we'll have persecution and rescue. And so I think we probably even see the persecution of the church in the end of Daniel chapter 12. If we look at that in some a little more detail, and this is where we were last week, under the Greek rule section there was Alexander, and then the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and we talked about the king of the north, king of the south, and basically Daniel is seeing a blow-by-blow of history in things coming for his far future, of course our ancient past, but his far future. And we have come down to verse 21, and in verse 21 we are going to take it up with this despised or despicable person, and we're going to have the time that really in so many ways is a really foundational setting for New Testament times. So Daniel 11:21, having said those things by way of review. So verse 21 of Daniel 11. In his place, in that one who dies but not in battle, in his place a despised or despicable person will arise. Royal honors will not be given him, but he will come during a time of peace and seize the kingdom by intrigue. A flood of forces will be swept away before him, and they'll be broken, as well as the covenant of peace. After an alliance is made with him, he will act deceitfully. He will rise to power with a small nation. All right, so we're going to get a despised person who gets the kingdom by intrigue. Now, what we find in history is, if we're correct in this Antiochus IV being the one, after his brother passed away, his brother's infant son ruled, took the throne as a baby with a regent. And then he went ahead and killed the baby and took the throne. And so he didn't have a big battle because how hard is it to fight a baby? It's kind of cruel, but this is what happened. And so at that time, there was also a priest of Jerusalem named Melanius, and he went there taking the tribute money for the Jews, and he used that money when he got to Antiochus, and he bribed Antiochus to let him be the high priest. And this starts a problem in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem at this time, there gets to be these two factions of people, one who want to follow the law, and one who want to follow a path of more or less of virtue and of some religious observance, and another group of people who are just very worldly and only really concerned about being in power. And this guy becomes the high priest in Jerusalem with the backing of Antiochus by a bribe, so you can guess which side he's probably on. All right, so then we see that in verse 24, as we go back and read some more of the text, it said, he will come in a time of peace. He will come to the richest parts of the province and do what his father and predecessors never did. He will lavish plunder, loot, and wealth on his followers, and he will make plans against fortified cities, but only for a time. And then with a large army, he'll stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. So this king is going to go attack down in Egypt. And then it says, let's see, I lost my place real quick. The king of the south will prepare for battle with an extremely large and powerful army, but he will not succeed because plots are made against him. Now, we have to say, that's very detailed, right? It's a lot of detail. This king will invade down there, and the other king will have a huge army, but will not prevail because of plots. Well, Antiochus, he did raise an army, and he went down to Egypt. as it says here, he lavished plunder and loot from the spoils of war that he undertook. He bought a lot of supporters. Down in Egypt, just like this prophecy said, this fellow Ptolemy, the ruler there, Ptolemy the Sixth, he raised a huge army, but he didn't win. And partly because his opponent bribed so many people on his side, and partly because he wasn't a very good general. And so that's exactly, this description, again, blow by blow, this description of things to come is exactly what did occur. So then the two kings, whose heart are bent on evil, will speak lies at the same table. So basically, they'll have a peace conference, but nothing will come about of it. They'll speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. And for soon will come the end at the appointed time, and the king of the north will return to his land with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant. He will take action and then return to his own land. Now, what happened in the history is that Antiochus was closing in on the city of Alexandria, and Ptolemy the Seventh, because the first Ptolemy that they had at that point, Ptolemy VI was so incompetent, his people replaced him with his brother, and so he became Ptolemy the Seventh, and we have his Greek name there, Euergetes. They made him king, hoping that he could do a little better than his brother. They had peace conferences, but nothing went there. Now, that took so long, and they were down there for a long time in Jerusalem, in Egypt, and there was a rumor in Jerusalem at that time that he died, just like his brother before him had been off at the far edge of the empire, his kingdom, and had died. There's a rumor that had spread in Jerusalem that occurred, and when that happened, one of the Jewish priests named Jason, he raised an army, and he began to fight against the local guys because, the king is dead, time for revolt. Turns out the king wasn't dead. And so when they finally got all that business of the various peace treaties and the like sorted out down in Egypt, he came by Jerusalem on the way home, and guess what he did to the rebels? He took the rebels out. And so it says that he killed tens of thousands. And so he just really laid waste to Jerusalem, and he plundered the temple. All right, so again, the summary we have in Daniel just fits exactly with the history of these people. All right, so verse 29. At the appointed time, he will come again to the south. So the guy in Damascus is again going to attack the south, but this time will not be like the first. It says ships of Kittim. Ships from these places far away will come against him, and being intimidated, he will withdraw. Well, his invasion, Antiochus' second attempt at invasion of Egypt, is one that is famous in all the history books. He got down there, and he found out that the Greeks, the Greek kingdom there in Egypt, they'd invited the Romans to come. And the Romans didn't have very many men down there with them yet, but there was an actual senator of Rome there, and the senator of Rome took his sword, literally drew a line in the desert, in the sand, and said, if you cross that line, you will be at war with all of Rome. And Antiochus IV was a terrible guy and an oppressive guy, but when it came to deciding whether or not he wanted to fight the Romans, he decided, I don't want to do that. And so he went home. And the historians tell us that is actually the origin of the common figure of speech that we still have to this day of drawing a line in the sand. That this Roman senator doing that is where that enters the lexicon as a common phrase, right? Of course, that's not the only time. Are there still other things we get from the Romans and their armies? What if you cross the Rubicon? Right? Julius Caesar was told by the Roman Senate, don't cross this river. What does he do? He crosses the river. They said, if you cross that river, you're in rebellion to the Senate, and we're going to go to war with you. He says, yeah, okay. He crosses the Rubicon, he crosses the river, and he goes and gets them. Well, we actually have from an incident that happened in this particular occasion, we have a figure of speech that is still used in the language today. All right, so he goes back then. He doesn't want to fight with the Romans. And so, notice what it says he will do because of his anger. Then he will rage, this is in verse 30, he will rage against the holy covenant and take action. On his return, he will favor those who abandon the holy covenant. His forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. They will abolish the regular sacrifice and set up the abomination of desolations. Okay, so about this one guy now, you notice how the prophecy is slowed down, and we have a lot of detail. And so there is one person in the intertestament period who desecrated the temple. And it's this same guy we've been talking about whose life fits every other part of this prophecy. It's this Antiochus the fourth. And so after he backed down from facing the Romans, he takes out his frustration on the Jews. And he had killed tens of thousands before, and now he does it again. And he no longer lets the Jews sacrifice on the altars in Jerusalem. He rededicates the temple to Zeus, and he sets about priests that he appointed, pagan priests, to offer sacrifices on those idols or on those altars with the idols that they've set up in the temple, and the thing that he had regularly sacrificed was pigs. Now, how do you decide I'm going to sacrifice pigs on these altars? Well, the way you do that is what? You know what these people hate the most, and what do? You do exactly that thing. And so he is intentionally disrespectful, as intentionally oppressive as he could possibly be. He outlawed observance of Sabbath. He outlawed the Jewish feast. He outlawed circumcision. And so he's just intentionally doing everything he can. He knows what the Jews consider holy. He knows what the Jews consider to be, sacred and meaningful, and he orders them to do the other things. And he forces them to watch as he does the most despicable things possible, which is why in Scriptures, what is it called? The despised or despicable person. And so it exactly tells us in this prophecy about what this coming king of the north will do. It does everything but name him, doesn't it? And again, in the entire period between Daniel and the time of Jesus, and then shortly after the destruction of the temple, there's only one period of time where sacrifices stop. There's only one period of time where somebody desecrates and despoils the temple. And it was that Antiochus the fourth. And so this is one of those occasions where there just is absolutely no doubt whatsoever as to who this prophecy is or what this is about. We would note one thing, though, is before the captivity, were there times when the Jews pretty much stopped offering sacrifices to God? Yeah, there were. There's a time where they moved the altar off to the side in the corner, right? And they set up an altar like the one that the king had seen up in Damascus. And in Ezekiel is shown visions of people worshiping the sun in the temple at Jerusalem. They're pictured as being out there in the courtyard of the temple, all of them bowing down facing east. And what does Ezekiel see them doing as the sun rises and peeks up over the mountain? They're all out there worshiping the sun. And so what was the reaction of that? Of the king, of the priests, and of the people, when before the captivity, that's what the kind of thing that these people did. Oh well, right? Did some people object? Yeah, guys like Jeremiah. And what did they get them? On this occasion, when this guy does these things, what's it going to bring? We know it's going to bring the Maccabean revolt, right? Why is there going to be a widespread It's not universal. But why is there going to be a widespread revolt at this paganism at this time when before the captivity there just hardly didn't even seem to be a whimper about it? What's the difference? All right, so I think there's some of that there. There's some of that. If somebody forbids you to go to church, what do you want to go do? Now, if you hadn't been forbidden to go to church on Sunday, now you want to go all of a sudden, what might you have done on Sunday anyway? At least what might a goodly number of people have done? We'll go next week. And so there's a natural human resentment to being forced into doing things and having things forced upon you where, what if you did it to yourself? You don't mind so much. I think there's that part of it. But also, isn't there a difference? Isn't there a difference among the people in their attitude now toward paganism and toward these affronts? I think there's a different spirit about it. And I think we're starting to see some of that mindset against these pagan incursions that we will see in the time of the Gospels. Because how long are the Gospels after this? Let me put up our timeline there. All right, so this Maccabean revolt will begin in the year 168. That is, so just about 200 years before the ministry of Christ, right? And it will be, 300 years after Daniel. So, but the thing Daniel is foreseeing is a conflict 300 years in his future. I got to ask you, what do you know about 300 years in the future? I don't know. In the year 2323, right? I don't know what's going to happen then. But this is much closer to the time of Jesus and much closer to the culture of the New Testament than the culture of the Old Testament. We're more than halfway through the intertestament period. And so what happens in the time of the Gospels when there's somebody breaks the Sabbath? No. Right? There's riots. There's objection. There's problems. Even Herod, Herod, you think, and we'll talk about him in a bit. All of the absolutely horrendous things that Herod does. You know how many times he messed with temple worship? Not at all. What did Herod do for the temple? He what? He expanded it. He made it a building that's the envy of the world. And how often did he go through there and look at the workmanship and inspect it all? He never did. Where did he watch it from? Yeah, there was a fortress built on one corner of the Temple Plaza, a place eventually called the Tower of Antonia, named after, in honor of one of the Roman rulers. And they built a viewing platform, a balcony out on the edge of that to look down into the temple. And the Jews weren't real happy with that, but, he's paying for it, so what are you going to do? But the Jews don't even want the Romans, the Roman dignitaries would come to town. They'd go up on that balcony, that platform, today they'd be what, a luxury box? They're up in the luxury boxes because, there's good catering and the like, and good refreshments. So they're up in the luxury box looking in. But they don't dare go in, do they? And so there's a difference in attitude. And we are closer to that attitude than we are to the Old Testament attitude. All right, so he, in verse 32, there's many Jews on his side. So the Maccabean revolt was somewhat a civil war. It was mostly directed at the Greeks, but the Greeks had a lot of allies among the Jews. With flattery, he will corrupt those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to many. Yet, They will fall by the sword and the flame, and be captured and plundered for a time. When they fall, they will be helped by some, but many others will join them insincerely. Some of those who have insight will fall, so they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time. All right, so we've got this conflict among the Jews who have insight and respect for the law and those who don't. And some will switch sides, it seems, back and forth. When Antiochus is doing well and he's handing out favors and bribes, they're all with him. When the Jews are doing well, who are they going to join up with? They're going to join up with them. And so again, describing what will occur in this just pretty much exact telling of what will happen when this revolt takes place. Now, in verse 36, then, and I'm going to switch up ahead. In verse 36, there is possibly a pause, and I think most likely a change to another future king. And who that king is under debate. There's some who think that Antiochus is continued to be the subject of verse 36 and on. There are others, and I at this point I'm leaning to this is looking forward even to Herod. I think, again, I'm not super confident on that. But the next real notable king after Antiochus in Jerusalem, because as we talked about when who controlled Jerusalem, there is a Jewish king after the Maccabean revolt. There is a Jewish king named Jason Hyrcanus, who is an important king, but he doesn't seem to fit the prophecy, and he's not a despicable and terrible person. Whichever king we're on here in verse 36 is certainly a despicable and terrible person, and so there's some who think we're just still going to be talking about Antiochus. We might, and it would seem to fit him some. There's some, and this is where I'm leaning right now, is that this is talking about Herod, who is the next really notable king. I know we skip a long time. There are some, especially premillennial folks and dispensational folks, they view this gap here as this next one who's coming is the Antichrist. Now, I have to say, if you're choosing between the despicable one, Antiochus IV, Herod the Great, or the Antichrist, could you have a lot of overlap in description? You could. And that's one of the things with some of these things of judgment especially. That is one of the things that when you deal with things of judgment, judgments often typify other judgments. And so in Matthew 24, everybody agrees that Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. But by the time you get to the end of Matthew 25, it sure seems like Jesus is talking about the end of the whole world. And where do you say he switched from one to the other? Well, I got a spot in Matthew 24 where I think he switches. But I used to not think that, and it might be that I don't think that again in the future. But one judgment typifies another. And so one of these wicked characters might typify another. But I will let you know, as we go into verse 36, we got three options. I don't think a future Antichrist who's going to literally rule is a very good option. But I'll let you know that's put out. Our two options in verse 36 as we go forward are Herod or Antiochus. And it really kind of seems to fit either one, but at this point I kind of think it fits Herod better. All right, so let's go on in verse 36, see what the text says. Then the king will do whatever he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god. He will say outrageous things against the God of gods, and he will be successful until the time of wrath is complete, because of what has been decreed will be accomplished. Well, I don't think there's anything in that description narrows down our candidate for who this terrible person is who will have a temporary success. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, the God desired by women, and that's a bit of an obscure. Some translations say he will have no regard for the desire of women, which, okay, in most translations, that sounds kind of like the charge of homosexuality. All right, we got Herod, we got a Greek guy, we got the Antichrist. Which one of those could be a homosexual? Take your pick. And some think that phrase "desire of women" refers to how little he cares for children, and that's a possibility. Antiochus, how does he get the throne? He kills a baby, right? How does Herod the Great try to keep the throne? He kills babies, literally. He killed a number of his own children. He killed all the babies of Nazareth. And, I mean, if it's the future Antichrist, what's he going to do to kids? Right? So that's he will not care for any of these gods or any other god, because he will magnify himself above all. That's where people who view this as future Antichrist go, oh, well. But I got to say, those other two guys would seem to fit that too. Instead, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god his fathers did not know, with gold and silver and precious stones and riches. He will deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will greatly honor those who acknowledge him, making them rulers over many and distributing land as a reward. Now, I got to say, that's where it doesn't sound like Antiochus. But that, to me, sounds a lot like Herod. Of course, future Antichrist too, I guess. All right. So, then at the end, verse 40, at the time of the end, so when we're going to end all this whole nonsense, and again, that's where if you're premillennial dispensational, it's the end. Or it's the end of the Greek rule, or it's the end of, because at the end of his own time, if it's Herod, the end of Greek rule over Jerusalem, if it's Antiochus. At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, but the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He will invade countries and sweep through them all like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land, and many will fall. But those who escape from his power, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of the Ammonites, he will extend his power over the countries, and not even the land of Egypt will escape. He will get control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt. The Libyans and the Cushites will also be in submission, but reports from the east and the north will terrify him. He will go out with a great fury to annihilate and completely destroy many. He will pitch his royal tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, and he will meet his end, and nobody will help him. All right, well, as our time is getting away, I can say if we make a bit of a stretch, we can find this being the Roman civil wars and the things of Herod and the like. It doesn't seem to fit Antiochus much at all. But it seems like, and this is where this gets kind of hard, because I got to say, up until we got through verse 35, we could just history timeline and history facts, lay it all down, like locking up like gears. From the time we got to verse 36 on, that gets a lot harder. There are things about Herod and the Romans that work pretty well for some of this, but there'd be some difficulties. If you believe in this, very literalistic historical fulfillment of all things, which has worked real well up through verse 36 with the history, I got to say the Herod doesn't work quite as well. And that's where people see this gap, which from verse 35, ending the Greeks, getting us down to Herod and his things, people make that gap all the longer and view a future Antichrist. And whoever this is, it appears that they're getting attacked by armies from two sides, from the north and the south. And I got to say, I don't understand how that fits with, real close tightness, any of these historical figures. Unless we're talking about the Jews who face the Romans and get destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. It does seem to me that we are getting up close, though, to the time of the Messiah. Because in chapter 12, which will be our study next time, there will be a time of distress like has never occurred, which seems to be like the descriptions of Matthew 24 of Jerusalem going to be destroyed, and the saints reigning. And so I think our options, I think Antiochus doesn't work. It works with a bit more figurative interpretation of Herod and then the Jewish rulers after them or after him, and the persecution of the church and the victory of the church, or that this is where in some ways shoving it into our future, which, that would mean this prophecy now encompasses over 2,000 years. But if you're premillennial dispensational, you'd say, see, all that's going to happen. And some of the theology of the Antichrist and the battles of Armageddon and the like are pretty easily slid into this text here, if you believe in that. I don't, but I have to say there are some things of which just sliding it into the future and saying it's going to happen, that Battle of Armageddon view, that would solve the interpretation of problems of some of this, although I don't know how you see a 2,500 year gap coming. I have a little trouble, making the 100-year gap between one king and the next after the first 35 verses. But skipping down 2,300 years, that's a whole different magnitude of things. But anyway, I just let you know that for all of the just, gear meshing and easy seeing through the first 35 verses, of which nearly everybody agrees on that part of the passage, it's not that difficult. But after verse 36, it seems to get more difficult. And after verse 40, it seems to get more difficult still in finding the historical match up to these things. But I think we have the Messiah in chapter 12, so I think whatever happened was before the Messiah came. So next time we have the concluding sections here in Daniel 12, verses 1 through 3, and then what Daniel's told to do with all this knowledge that the Lord has laid out for him.